Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on Remembrance Day, and joining now to share his perspective is Dr. Jonathan Vance, again, history professor at Western University and J.B. Smallman Chair. Dr. Vance, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Why should Canada be proud of her military history?
Well, we were a very small country when the First World War began, with very little in the way of military capability. And yet we emerged as one of the key armies winning the war in 1918. And again, in the Second World War, we had very little to begin with in terms of military capability, but built our army, our industrial capacity, our Navy, our Air Force remarkably quickly, and emerged at the end of the war in 1945 as essentially a superpower. So I think we've demonstrated how we are able to, it sounds kind of silly, but come to the rescue of the world when we're needed.
Do we still have that capability?
That's a really good question. And in some ways, we don't really know until we're pressed. In the 1930s, probably no one would have said that we could develop within a few years such a significant military infrastructure, such a significant capacity to produce strategic minerals. Now, the things that militaries use in the 21st century are a lot more complicated now. But in some ways, we wouldn't really know until we were forced to. And frankly, your guess is as good as mine.
I know, because some in the younger generation, again, some people don't read history and they don't realize. That's why I'm glad that you're here as a history professor, as a guest, to share with us, what Canada's contribution was. Because Remembrance Day was really initially started to honor the Great War, which was World War One. And, unless you're looking at the videos of that trench warfare, and my goodness, it was such a, again, in the opener I said 650,000 Canadians served in World War One and 66,000 lost their lives. That's a huge contribution.
Very much so. And it was, as you probably know, Remembrance Day was originally called Armistice Day, and was focused on the armistice of November 1918, but it was changed a decade later because of the belief that the country should be remembered more generally, not just a specific point in time. And so it's Remembrance Day as we know it. And it has obviously grown and changed and reshaped itself to deal with different wars, different kinds of competence, different participation. But it's always a reminder of what we were able to do as a nation. And the key phrase there, I think, as a nation, what we were able to do as a nation when we were needed.
And when the fight for freedom was so great.
Exactly. And I mean, we think the First World War typically nowadays is thought of as an imperial war, with all the kind of negative connotations that go with that. But we have to remember that in 1918, a big chunk of northern France was occupied by the Germans and had been occupied since 1914. And so the Canadians who are involved in freeing northern France in September, October, November 1918, they are very much liberators. They see their work as liberating French villages, French farmers, Belgian villages, Belgian farmers, just like the Canadians who liberated the Netherlands in 1944-45. So imperial war maybe, but for the guys who were actually fighting on the ground, this was a war to free people from military occupation.
You teach the younger generation, the generations coming up. Do you feel that people are forgetting? Not even just young, old as well. Are people forgetting?
I think it's easier to forget. It requires an effort to remember, not just once a year, but on an ongoing basis. I think though one point that I'd like to make is that everyone talks about the ignorance of the younger generation about history, and the fact that they don't know these events, they don't know the stories. I think we shouldn't equate ignorance with lack of interest, because once it's presented to them, I find they're enormously interested, and they get right into it. So I think that's one thing that gives me a great deal of hope. When you present this history to them in an engaging, meaningful fashion, they see the importance of it, not just on an international sense, but for individual Canadians, for their own communities, for their society. So yeah, I'm very much encouraged by that.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Even when we look at what's happening in Israel and Gaza, people are saying, "Well, what was the history of that region? What happened there?" And I do agree that there's a hunger to find out what exactly is going on in the history. We'll be
Yeah, I
picking
mean,
this.
war
I have
is
to cut to
sadly.
commercial. Sorry, I've got to cut to commercial, but we'll pick this up in just a moment.